Well, howdy again, it's old Buster coming to you. Got another story here for you called Makin Whiskey. Well, it's all in the water, said Buster to Jesse. That and pure organic grain with no chemicals or additives. The best whiskey in the world is what is going to be made here because nobody else makes it that way. Well, Jesse told Buster they was going to stick to the original McBrayer recipe and agreed they'd use only the best and purest ingredients. None of that GMO stuff Monsanto was putting out. Well, all the boys and their folks and Walter's sisters come up to Kentucky to see Aunt Judith and crank up the distillery. Excuse me. When they got there after all the boys graduated from their high school, they had the dangest party you ever did see. Aunt Judith and Elizabeth Jane invited some folks they knowed over to meet the family and enjoy the festivities. They had them a shindig in the ballroom of the mansion, and with all manner of victuals too. The band was some fellers over from Nashville that knowed of the Tipton and McBrayer clans, and volunteered to play for the evening and bring their families along as well. It was a night to remember. They all danced and ate and drank till near about dawn, and the old McBrayer was a-flowing pretty free-like. The old feller the boys met up when they first hit town there was there too. He was sure enough feeling his oats for a spell, but then took to a napping later on in the evening. The Ollinger gals and Elizabeth Jane made up a bed for him, and the boys toted him on up to the room and settled him on in. Now, he was out till late morning. When he got up, he said he ain't had such fun for nigh on 20 years. Oh, some of the folks stayed the night, and some went on back home, but the next day they had a late breakfast for all of them and visited till time for chores. Well, that evening all the folks and the boys gathered in the parlor, and Aunt Judith got out the family Bible and began to telling how all of them was kin in the McBrayer and Tipton families. Well, Aunt Judith never was married up. She had a sweetheart that was in the service with Alvin York. He was over from Jamestown from where they lived. They was to be married when he come back home, but he was killed with the mustard gas in the trenches. Alvin come by and told Aunt Judith he was with him when he passed and give her his last words in a letter he was a-writing at the time just before he died. Now, Alvin said Tom, that was his name, dearly loved her and said he was sorry they didn't have a life on this here earth, but he would be a-waiting on the other side for her. Alvin said Tom would do to ride the river with, and a fine a friend and feller could ever have. Excuse me, folks. Tom was a right brave feller and saved Alvin's life when the Germans snuck in at night and was going to pig stick him in the back with a bayonet. Now, Aunt Judith's sister, Julie, married up to William Stokes, and they had a daughter, Mary Virginia, who married up to Jackson Barrett, who bore Elizabeth Jane. Now, Julie and William Stokes died right before their Mary Virginia from the gripe and the dysentery. Now, Aunt Judith's folks was Lucinda Jane Tipton and Samuel McBrayer. Her grandparents was Major Jonathan Tipton and Alice May Daniels on her mama's side, and John Edward McBrayer and Patricia Stamper on her pa's side. Well, John had a brother, Archie McBrayer, that married up to a Claudette Rousseau of New Orleans, and they had 3 youngins, Jesse, James, and Sarah Loreen. Well, Jesse married Sarah Lukes, and they had Jesse Darrell, and Loreen Clara married up Russell Tipton and had Buster. Now, what happened was Jesse was 13 years older than Loreen Clara and was gone from home when she was 3. In the years Jesse was gone, his and folks and Loreen and her husband died, and Buster went to live with his grandparents on Russell's Mall's side, the Orlicheks. So everybody lost touch and just didn't know who belonged to who, nor if and Buster was even born. Now that's why Buster and Jesse didn't know they was first cousins. Well, everything got straight and everybody was plumb excited over everything. Well, Aunt Judith rehashed everything about Jesse Darrell and Buster, and the arrangements she done made for them 2 boys and Elizabeth Jane. Well, of course, all of them would be took care of, but she wanted the young'uns to keep the Tipton and McBrayer names a-going and let the young'uns take up where the McBrayer distillery left off. Now, everybody agreed with Aunt Judith and said they would help keep things on the right track since they was parents and kin and had the experience of living as long as they have and in business as well. Now, the next morning, everybody headed to the barn where the distillery was. Inventory and stock was took to see what all was there and what was needed to get things a-rolling. Well, Hired showed them all the secret escape tunnel to the creek, and Aunt Judith opened up the panel to the limestone cave where she had them old McBrayer whiskey barrels stored. There were 72 barrels of that old McBrayer just a-aging in the racks. It surely was the finest whiskey in America and would stand with any other in the world. Now, Aunt Judith got out the original recipe, and her Grandpa Gus began to discussing what all was needed and the measurements. Now, folks, this is a true recipe for Old McBrayer whiskey. Now, it's a real whiskey, real name. You can research it, figure out what all you want about it, but it's the real thing. And here's how it was made. 88.4% of corn. 5.8% of rye. They kind of give it that spice. That corn made it sweet. And 5.8% of malt. What was called for, and Grandpa Gus said it weren't no newfangled seed neither. It had to be raised natural. Organic, they called it. Using only manure to make this whiskey. That's the fertilizer. Yeast and pure water was very critical for the process. The creek was fed by a spring coming in from the limestone in the mountain and passed right on through the distillery. The mix made far less than the new way of making whiskey, but it sure was the best sipping whiskey a body could drink. Now, old W.H. McBrayer had himself a distillery over in Anderson County, but here in McBrayer Springs, the old McBrayer distillery made better whiskey than anywhere. The distillery was moved to Montgomery County in 1899. But the McBrayers was making whiskey long before that and went to using the original recipe. This and here is how they done it. Well, I'm just going to give you a little touch of what they said. First off, they ground the mixture of corn and rye to a rough grind about the texture of coarse sand. A grain seed consists mostly of starch. Then we go on to tell, and that's why I tell you folks to write me at busterandtheboys@yahoo.com, and I'll give you all the directions on how to make it and the equipment used and the process and everything. So, if you want it, just write me at busterandtheboys@yahoo.com. You can see me turning these pages because that's all about how to make this whiskey. And the type of barrels they got. They use bourbon barrels. And they have to char those barrels. And there's a way to do it, and then they seine out or use a filter, seine it out, all the leavings and so forth, and leaves the whiskey. Well, I'm going to read a little bit about this now. The old McBrayer warehouse is only 1 floor high. That gives old McBrayer whiskey a special, they call it maturation, and limits the amount of barrels that you can store. The old McBrayers brings a right good price, better than any other whiskey, because it's so special and so good and the supply is limited. If you enter the warehouse, you're first overwhelmed by the bourbon and vanilla smell, which penetrates the entire area. If you walk past the warehouse, you can still detect the smell in the air. And old McBrayer has its own bottling line. They select the barrels, and they bring them in by hand truck to the bottling line, and they're emptied over filters, like I say. The pieces of charcoal which fell off the cast walls during the transport of the and maturation time are held back by the sieve. The bourbon's pumped by hand to a storage vat and fed from there to the bottling line. Well, that's about how it's done. Old McBrayer whiskey is ready for drinking and to be enjoyed as the finest whiskey ever made. Well, Dubs and Walter began to fixing up all the storage racks and done some welding and greasing and oiling of the bottling line. Big Jim and Hired worked out behind the distillery to repair some sluices that brung the water from the spring into the distillery for distilling, the cooling, and fermenters. Well, Jesse and Jessie Darrell inspected the limestone cave where Aunt Judith had them 72 barrels of old McBrayer hid out and all of the distilling equipment. And Buster and Grandpa Gus got the old grist mill in working order and got the makings of the mash together too. Now that old grist mill was a heck of a contraption. I tell you, it could be operated by the water from the spring or by using a mule to turn the wheel. Now some of the women folk helped out with the yeast to brew, and with the rest of them helped out in the house, and they had to paint and sew and cook and clean, you know. Now Ms. Ollinger and Ms. McBrayer went on into town with Elizabeth Jane to get some supplies and materials for fixing up the place, and ordered up some lumber and equipment that they needed. Now some of the equipment would take a couple of weeks to get in, and by that time everything ought to be ready for starting up the distillery. Now in the old days that followed, there was lots of activity going on. Well, I mean in the days that followed, I don't know how old he was, but there was old days. There was lots of activity going on at the McBrayer Mansion and old McBrayer Distillery. All the folks was busy, and the two women folk that had been with Aunt Judith for so long was give a little surprise. Them two ladies was Maureen and Colleen McGregor, and they was sisters-in-laws. They was direct descendants from the folks that come to this country with old Hugh Forbes, and was pert near kissing cousins with the McBrayers. Now they both was married up for a spell, but both their husbands died and their young'uns was back in Scotland. Now tickets was got for them to go back to Scotland to visit their young'uns and kin, and enough money not to need for nothing whilst they was gone. Now they'd be gone for a month, but all the folks would be there to help out whilst they was gone. That's Buster and Jesse's folks and all the rest of them. Walter's and Jesse's and Howard's. The day they left, Aunt Judith and Elizabeth Jane teared up something awful, and it was plumb pitiful how all the rest of them women folks did too. Now, all the men just had to lie to shuck to get a loose from all that weeping. Well, finally all the goodbyes was said, and the McGregors was on their way, all the while as a promising to write and to come a-running if they was needed. Things was a-going on right well, and everybody was happy, and the work sure showed as the place was beginning to be put to right. The house was spick and span, and the distillery was just about to get cranked up. But one day, coming on the evening, Jesse, Buster, Walter, and Hired was a-sitting in the limestone cave a-having a break in a mite of the hair of the dog when Dubs and Big Jim come in tracing down a leak in the sluice in the back of the limestone there in the cave. Well, whilst they was looking for the problem, they stumbled onto a rock under the sluice that seemed to give some access to it. Well, when Dubs and Big Jim went to prodding at their rock, it moved a mite. Well, lo and behold, it moved all right, and behind it was a cubby hole that opened up to a room on the other side of the wall. Well, Jesse crawled on in there and lit himself a lantern and hollered back to the others that this was something to see. Well, all manner of charts and a big old chest was there, as well as a table and some chairs. Well, Jesse said he was going to scout around and see what all was there, and if there was another way in. Well, Walter and Hired crawled in the room too, but Buster was too big to get through that hole. Well, the boys got to looking for anything that might be another entrance, and finally Hired found a right ingenious way of opening a door to the outside. You put your hand in this crack in the rock, it pulled a lever and a bolt slid back, and you released a metal door that come in from the creek side of the building behind a huge boulder. Now it was on the north side of the escape tunnel, and the concealed doorway had to have been put in when the tunnel was made. Well, Hired pulled the lever, and Walter went on out and found the other lever to get in from the outside. Now Buster and the menfolk went on out to the creek and found Walter and went in the room that-a-way. Now all them charts was a-telling all manner of escape routes and battlement positions and plans of buildings and whatnot. And one document was signed by George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, all presidents of the United States of America. And it read, the bearer of this document of either the Tipton or McBrayer families that has engaged in the practice of law shall be seated on the Supreme Court of the United States of America without question due to the supreme service rendered to their country. Be it known that a person of said lineage duly authorized by the patriarchal hierarchy shall be recognized as Commander-in-Chief of all military operations on American soil to ensure compliance to the Constitution of the United States of America. This document is sworn and attested to by the sitting President of the United States of America, Thomas Jefferson, the second President of the United States of America, John Adams, and the first President of the United States of America, George Washington. This executive order dated March 3, 1809 is irrevocable and inviolable ad infinitum. God save the United States of America. Now on the same document was an added postscript. I, Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States of America, have reviewed this document and hereby concur with its edicts. For God and country, I attest with all authority of the presidency on this 14th day of April in the year of our Lord, 1865. Man, oh man, if and this one wasn't a humdinger, I'll tell you. There was other documents in such in which this and several others banded up that the boys and men folks ain't even had time to read. Now all of them sit down in that there little room and sure enough scratch their heads over this. They all discuss what in the world to do with something like this. Well, finally, Buster's Grandpa Gus says this here was sure something to be put to their thinking caps on about, and something this important could most likely put powerful folks in a dither and a twitch. Big Jim and Dubs looked at each other and said about the same time to just call Hiram Holmes. They figured he could be trusted and he could sort all this out. Well, Jesse said we ought to ask for Dalton and Devane to come protect this here parcel of history, because if and it fell into the wrong hands, there'd be hell to pay. Well, the boys and the menfolk closed up the room, and all sign of any entrance went up to the house. Supper was about to be set on the table when they all got in, and before they all got settled, Jesse asked all the women to gather in the parlor. Well, the news sure stirred up a conversation, that's for sure. Questions was a-coming right and left. And after a bit, Jesse made the suggestion to call Hiram Holmes again, because that seemed to be the best idea, and asked if and everybody would give their vow not to breathe a word to nobody about this. Of course, all of them said they knowed how important this news was, and it went without saying they wasn't going to say nothing. Well, Buster said, let's eat, and headed for the supper table. Well, Aunt Judith said she didn't know nothing about the secret room, nor what was in it. She did recollect that her great-grandpa told her when she was a child that if and she ever wanted to take up the law that there was something special awaiting for her. She said she paid no never mind to it and ain't even thought about it till now, and that was pretty near 80 years ago. Well, after supper, Hiram Holmes was called and told all the things without going into too much detail, because somebody might overhear their conversation. Mr. Holmes said he would dispatch agents immediately and they would be there before morning. The folks and the boys' discussions went on into the night, burning the midnight oil, a-ciphering and everything. Come daylight and the sunrise, all a-glowing on the horizon, there was a knock on the door. Well, Buster's Grandma answered it, and Dalton said, "Good morning, Miss Aldercheck." She smiled and told him to come on in for breakfast, and that it was good to see him again. He said that Devane and Beebe was right behind him unloading the truck, and they'd be right on in. Well, everybody was up and at him, and Jessie Darrell done seed Beebe, and she run up and hugged him proper like. The boys all said howdy, and the folks all shook hands with them and said how glad it was to them Mr. Holmes sent. Dalton said when Hiram called that they wouldn't have it no other way but to come. What a breakfast they had that morning. They all eat till they was about pretty near the pop. Them boys in the hog heaven with eggs, pan-fried taters, milk gravy, fresh biscuits, homemade bread, and fresh churned butter, smoked ham and red-eye gravy, honey, peach and strawberry jam, slab peppered bacon, sweet tater pancakes, and hot chocolate with whipped cream and coffee and milk. There was even a muscadine grape juice, fresh squeezed and chilled. Well, when breakfast was done, the menfolk and the boys showed Dalton and Devane the entrance to the secret room. Well, Jesse Darrell stayed behind with Bebe in the house, saying he was going to help clean up. Well, that didn't happen. Him and Bebe sit out on the porch swing, just a swinging. It was a talking and just a swinging when they all come back up to the house with all the documents and papers and chests. Well, the table was cleared off, and Dalton and Devane began to sort through all the documents and papers, trying to figure out what they was all about. Dalton called up Mr. Holmes, told him on his secure phone what he had and what all he was seeing, and about the document signed by the presidents. Well, Hiram said he was a-coming his himself and would bring a feller or two with him to authenticate the documents and papers. Well, whilst Dalton and Devane was going through the papers with Bebe and Elizabeth Jane a-helping, the boys and menfolks went on back to work starting up the distillery. Big Jim and Grandpa Gus went into town to get the new equipment and some more supplies, and the rest of them started setting up. Well, Buster and Walter got the grist mill grinding the corn and rye and was getting the mash ready to cook. The yeast was ready too, so operation was ready to begin that afternoon when Big Jim and Grandpa Gus got back. Well, after dinner, Dalton told them all that the papers and documents went to the very heart of the foundation of America, and how important to never let anybody know about what was found there. He said Mr. Holmes would speak to them all when he got there and studied all the contents of the chest and the documents on the papers. Well, smoke was a-coming out the chimneys, that's for sure, 'cause them cookers was a-going full blast. It'd be next week before things got to rolling full speed, so there was a little time on their hands excepting for checking on the cookers and such. Well, Aunt Judith was all perky due to the excitement. Miss Ollinger, Miss McBrayer, Miss Holmes, and Grandma Orlichek done told her all about some of the dealings and adventures they done had with Dalton, Devane, and Mr. Holmes. The ladies said they was all safe and sound with them around, and then they told Aunt Judith how Bebe took a shine to Jesse Darrell. His and pheromones done betwixt that gal and many others. And she was a fine gal, fine as they could ask for her to be in the family, if she was ever to be. But Jesse Darrell was going to take up lawyering at the University of Alabama, and then when he was done with school and settled down, he'd marry up. Ms. McBrayer said she'd hope everything stayed the same, and she'd wait for Jesse Darrell, 'cause she sure cottoned to that gal. Now, Ms. McBrayer also said they was going to have prayer time when all the boys and menfolk got in that evening. With what all was going on, they sure needed the Lord in the mix. Even old Abe Lincoln and the others said that. Of course, all the ladies agreed to that. Would all go into the parlor after supper. Well, around about 4 o'clock, Hiram Holmes and a couple of his fellers got to the house. They greeted everybody, and he toured the grounds and buildings and took stock of what all was done and transpired. He paid special attention to the room and the escape tunnel. After he was done and visited with Dalton and Devane, they went in to supper. Your tongue would slap your tonsils with the supper them women folk laid out. Roast pork, sauerkraut, turnip greens, corn on the cob, sliced maters, mashed taters, gravy, fried okra, green beans, sweet tater casserole, wilted lettuce leaf salad with hot dressing, peach soup, fresh rolls and butters. Oh, that fresh rolls, triple yeast rolls, and fried chicken. For dessert, they had pecan, coconut, and apple pies, apple dumplings, and fresh turned ice cream, sweet tea, and coffee to drink rounded off the meal. Now, Mr. Holmes said he ain't never ate nothing like that, what was served that night, and his and feller just wouldn't quit, even though they had to loosen their ties and belts and breeches. Well, after retiring to the parlor, Aunt Judith said they was going to have a prayer meeting. The fellers with Mr. Holmes made to go outside, but Aunt Judith and them ladies put the evil eye on them and told them the prayer meeting was for everybody. They sat down and said they were sorry, that they thought it was just for the family. Now, Ms. Ollinger told Buster and Walter to start with the Bible reading of their choice. Now, Buster began with Ecclesiastes 12:13, fear God and keep his commandments, so that's the whole duty of man. And Walter gave John 3:16, that God gave his only begotten son. Now, Aunt Judith said a prayer and invited anyone else to say a prayer if they'd like to. Well, all the women folk, including Bebe, offered up a prayer too, and then Mr. Holmes took to talking about the Lord like a preacher. When all was said and done, Aunt Judith asked Devane to say the closing prayer. He cleared his throat a few times, but gave a rendition of Elmer Gantry and oratorical skill in a praying, and all said amen and amen. Well, Mr. Holmes asked everybody to go about their daily chores as usual, and he'd give them all a report that afternoon before supper. He asked Dalton, Devane, and Bebe to stay behind for a conference with him and the two other fellers. That's Alfred and Horace. What he done told them was in dire straits, he said. Them papers would blow the lid plumb off of Washington. The president couldn't be trusted with this knowledge. Just ain't no telling what all would happen with all the international ramifications of this find. One thing was for sure. The safety of these folks come first, and the safety of these documents as well. Well, Dalton asked Hiram if he knowed how they all fit together. Hiram said he wasn't all clear yet, but if they would look back at some of their missions, they would see that they was just the tip of the iceberg. It was big, really big. Some major players in the world would definitely take on an interest in these documents, even to the extent of sacrificing alliances in money and men. Whatever it took was the order of the day, was the way he seed it. Well, Mr. Holmes said this was scary even for the bunch in the Presidential Corps, but this was their real job. They would all just see how it all played out. Now, Mr. Holmes told them all that even with all their secrecy and precautions, it was going to leak. And when it did, to be prepared for the worst. It was going to be bad. Just a matter of time. Mr. Holmes said he wanted to explain some things to them all about the papers and documents and all. He said it was right unbelievable, but he knowed all of them trusted him, and he was a-telling them all on the square that what he was a-saying was the truth. He said the Supreme Court appointments was due to both Tipton's and McBrayers, being lawyers and judges back then, and what they done for their country that incurred a debt that couldn't be paid. Their patriotism was repaid with the honor of molding truth and justice in America's laws, but still demanded continued sacrifice to duty. The presidents that signed that document knowed that the Constitution would be in good hands. Now, Mr. Holmes went on to say that all them charts and plans and papers had to do with the battle for control over the United States in the world. When the country was first being formed, Tipton's and McBrayers was in the Masons. They found out that diabolical plans was laid to destroy the country before it even got off the ground, and the evil fellers heading up something called the Illuminati was going to rule as a shadow government. The Tipton and McBrayer ancestors took exception to that and got to the presidents to let them know all that, and they signed them documents. President Lincoln was given information on what was really going on with the war the night before he was killed. The last part of the document said that the heads of the two families had to agree on a military commander to uphold the Constitution or in the event of a takeover attempt of the United States. Mr. Holmes said the reason the Presidential Corps was established outside the boundaries presently prescribed by laws passed by crooked politicians is to do just that. In fact, the Presidential Corps was mandated by Tipton and McBrayer influence and was to be used in conjunction with the edict of the document. Heck, fire! He didn't even know that. Well, needless to say, there was going to be some scoundrels upset over all this because it throwed a monkey wrench into their plans of one world government. Of course, a lot of these papers and documents could be kept secret, but some of them was bound to be found out. They had to be used to fight the buzzards, not only in the U.S. but worldwide. He reckoned the Presidential Corps was going to take a new direction in some cases and employ methods to fix the situation that wasn't going to be pretty. Had to be done, though. Now, he was going to give them all some information that'd peel their ears back, but it was from reliable resources and his and group as well. They done put 2 and 2 together and come up with 4 in this case. Dalton and Devane confirmed what Mr. Holmes was saying by way of their missions and what they personally experienced and found out. They allowed it just weren't by no book. Now, Mr. Holmes and Beebe and Elizabeth Jane, Mr. Holmes had, Beebe and Elizabeth Jane to pass out a written report for each of them. And it went on to tell them about the powerful front groups of the Illuminati and the 13 families that made it up and who started it and where it started and the history of it. And it went on to tell all about how this all come apart. Well, anyway, like I say, you write me at busterandtheboys@yahoo.com and I'll send it to you because it's too much to read here. Well, Mr. Holmes said he hoped this report would be helpful to understand what all was going on and how it all got started. Well, Grandpa Gus spoke up and said he knowed for true that this one was right, and he and his and Pa experienced some of this in Czechoslovakia before they come to America. Well, Mr. Holmes could sure enough count on him and do anything to thwart these here crazy people. He said all it was that somebody wanted what somebody else had and wanted to control everything. Well, everybody agreed to that. After the meeting, everybody went about their business, and the distillery was a-cooking away, and the house and place was sure enough spruced up by this time. She was a-gleaming like the dew on a Kentucky bluegrass. Mr. Holmes and the 2 fellers, Alfred and Horace, left out the next day, and them boys took a passel load of victuals with them too. They just couldn't get enough to eat. Well, Mr. Holmes said he would contact Dalton with more information and specific instructions at a later time, but for them to stay close to the boys and their folk. When Mr. Holmes got back to his office, he began to studying on the document and other papers and attesting them with equipment that was far too sophisticated to bring to McBrayer Springs. He had to use the bathroom, and his executive secretary assistant come in whilst he was gone to the loo. Now, ain't nobody allowed in that room excepting by special order, but this here woman was nosing around trying to sniff out something to buy her fleshly desires. Her name was Mona Dean Tyler, about 55-year-old and frumpy looking but efficient. She was vetted early on in her career with the government, but her worldly ways done got her into a pickle. She hornswoggled some funds from a mission and nobody was the wiser. And her depraved relations, the fellers on the bad side, got on to her and had her over a barrel. She was what they call a mole. Anyhow, she sneaked a peek at the document and papers with the list of names and all and took some pictures from a little camera no bigger than a pack of ready rolls. She got out of the door right before Mr. Holmes got back into the room and skedaddled to a drop-off and left the film. Wasn't long before she was contacted, and she told the men that come for her all she knowed, and then they killed her and left her in a swamp in a quicksand. Now, old Hiram had his ways, and when they come for him, he was way ahead of them. He had the best team of assassins that could be had, and they protected him to a man with their lives. The red flags went up when a feller acted like he done got lost and run into a tree outside of Mr. Holmes' house and wanted to use the telephone. They come from all sides like a pack of wolves, and there was a shootout likened to the OK Corral. Fellers was a-coming over the wall, through the gate, and into the house. Now, old Hiram Holmes was a little long in the tooth, but he was sure enough pison when he was riled, I'll tell you. There was about 20 of the bad guys, and Mr. Holmes' force was outnumbered 2-1. Do I need to tell you who come out on top? No sirree. 2 of the invaders was captured and the rest killed. Only a couple of Mr. Holmes' men was wounded but not hurt bad. The 2 fellers that was captured was took to an underground facility for the interrogation, and they spilled the beans. One of them didn't know much, but the other, that one had some story to tell, and it weren't good. He was spouting all kinds of nonsense, but give up enough to put Mr. Holmes on the right track to finding out what was what. Neither of them fellers see the light of day. Good riddance to bad trash, said Mr. Holmes. Mr. Holmes pulled in all of his operatives he could possibly spare, and a few private and retired contractors and agents as well. They hit the bricks and used every possible resource they had for information. They hit a dead end at every turn except in one lead that come up. It was a head knocker over at the Mormon church, and a buddy of his'n from China, last name of Lee, L.I. Well, Hiram made a call to a real good friend of his'n there in China and made up to meet with him in Dublin, Ireland with their guest. There was an old stronghold of the IRA that Mr. Holmes knowed about. He told his old friend Zhang to meet up with him there. They was going to get to the bottom of this mess even if it hairy-lipped ugly ape. Now, Mr. Holmes been kidnapped the Mormon feller, and Zhang got his man too, and their private jets was a-flying them all to Dublin within 2 hours flat. Well, sir, these two old boys had their lips buttoned up tighter than Dick's hat band. Between Mr. Holmes and Zhang, they got the truth to unravel. Their house of cards was surely about to tumble, but it was going to take a mite of doing to separate the good guys from the bad ones, and some very important people was going to be took out. Not down, but out. Don't wait supper is what Mr. Holmes said to them fellers, 'cause you traders ain't going to make it. Two quiet little pops, and it was lights out for 'em. Seemed like word spread like wildfire about the document and all them papers. Mr. Holmes was keeping tabs on what was going on around the world, and something was up and on the move. Now, Mr. Holmes put all the papers, documents, and the chest into the safest place he knowed of that nobody knowed of except in folks he could trust. The underwater treasure cave in the Bahamas that the boys found on vacation. Now, Mr. Holmes called in Walter's Uncle Jeff, had him to take what all he needed and the men he trusted to carry it all there by submarine, and to wait there till he or Dalton or Devane contacted him. Well, in the meantime, forces was a-gathering to wipe out all living souls at McBrayer Springs. Well, Mr. Holmes called up Dalton and told him what was going to take place, and to gear up and fast. He was a-sending help, and they would get there as soon as possible. The next evening, all the folks and the boys was ready and waiting. It was kind of like the Alamo. The trusting part was the thing here, 'cause you just didn't know who was who and which side of the fence they was on. Well, when they come hard. The first charge pretty near had 'em, but a bunch of fellers from out of South America come in like gangbusters and drove 'em off. The second one was really fierce, but they managed to hang on. It was the third charge that was the one that was going to do 'em in. It was pure D luck that none of the boys or the families was hurt, but the soldiers was shot up pretty bad, and the women folk was attending to 'em along with a medic or two that was there. The other forces sent in by Mr. Holmes just couldn't get there and get through, and was a-fighting with all they had, but they wasn't going to get there in time to save everybody. But just at the darkest hour, men folk began to coming out the woods. They was a-carrying all manner of weapons, and they sure took a toll on them bad guys. Dalton looked to the boys and the families with a wonderment on his face and asked who in the tarnation was these people. Well, Aunt Judith recognized some of the men from town and round about the county, said they was Tiptons and McBrayers. Well, that turned the tide, and they reckoned some of them escaped, but not many. When Mr. Holmes got there, he told them all what done happened, and them papers was a secret call to arms. Every head of household was told to it by word of mouth from generation to generation. Some of the clans even had secret meetings telling of it, and a warning to always be prepared. Now, Mr. Holmes didn't know if and it would work, but he said he had to try. TV, radio, and newspapers carried the line, "Old McBrayer was selling for 4 bits a pint at McBrayer Springs. The hills come alive and they come a-running." The cleanup and debriefing of all the Tiptons and McBrayers took nigh on to 2 days. camps was made down by the creek, and women folk cooked up victuals and tended to the wounded that didn't have to go to the hospital. Guards was kept up, patrolling night and day by the professional soldiers, but clans had their way of keeping watch too, and even taught the soldiers a thing or two. There was lots of goings on, I'm a-telling you, and many of the young men wanted to join up to fight the invaders. Well, Mr. Holmes said there weren't no need, but Grandpa Gus wanted to get on in the middle of the fracas no matter what, and Buster and Grandma had to tone him down. Grandma got him by the ear and said, "Gus, you hush now." Grandpa Gus mumbled something about he was madder'n a cat with his tail under a rocker. Now, Mr. Holmes told them how the cow ate the cabbage as best he knowed, and told them they had to look real close at the folks on the list and the ones that cozied up to them. The president was in on it, along with most of his henchmen in the government. All the folks knowed something wasn't right in America, and it was time when them politicians and other ne'er-do-wells was held accountable for their deeds. The powerful people in Europe had to be sent a message not to fool with the U.S. of A., because if and they did, they was going to get snake bit good and proper. Now, Mr. Holmes said the leaders of the countries that was trying to do right was going to get support, and movements all over the world was going to take back their countries. Yep, sure enough they were. After all was said and done, and folks left on out back to their homes and jobs, Mr. Holmes had a little powwow with the families. He said he was right proud of Aunt Judith for cooking, really conking with her cast iron skillet feller over the head and saving the life of one of his men. Aunt Judith just smiled humble-like and said she was just a-fighting for family and country, is all. Plus he was a-making a cake she had. She was a-baking, he was causing it to fall. And you know how it is when you bake a cake, you don't want anybody messing around and making waves there. Well, Uncle Jeff was called, and he brung the papers and documents along with the chest back to the house. They discussed what all was to be done about the document, and Mr. Holmes gave his advice to put everything for safekeeping till some of this carrying on settled out. He said that he wanted to inform the Tipton and McBrayer clans of the provisions protecting the country and the Constitution, and they all had to vote on who that would be if need be. Now, Mr. Holmes said he would be right proud to inform the president that he had to see the Supreme Court justice from one of the families when the time come. It would sure enough curl his toenails if he was still in office. Well, all of them took off, they took on off the next morning, but not without taking a bottle of old McBrayer with each of them. Well, Aunt Judith said she'd send some of the new batch when it was ready, and for them to compare it to be sure to let her know how it was. Well, Bebe and Jessie Darrell went off to themselves for a spell to say their goodbyes. And Uncle Jeff met up with Walter, Dubs, and Miss Ollinger before he left on out too, and Dalton and Devane visited with all of them before they left with Mr. Holmes. Now, after all the doings was over, things settled down and everybody got back down to the business of making whiskey. Well, Jessie Darrell made a deal with the top bourbon suppliers to ship the limited supply to them for a record price. Some of the old McBrayer was to be given to the McBrayer and Tipton families for free, and it was suggested that by Aunt Judith for the Tiptons and McBrayers to have a reunion every year after that. Of course, the Holmes and Ollinger families and the men and women was also invited that helped them through all their adventures. Elizabeth Jane said she was going to go back to Europe to see her feller and perhaps look into finishing up her schooling there. She'd let them know. The Ollinger gals, Pamela Kay and that's Carla May and Mary Gale, would stay till the McGregors got back, and the boys would stay till the distillery and the place was operating smoothly and good help was found to fill in for them. The folks were going to leave at the end of the week to go on back home, so all of them wanted to visit as much as they could and continue on finding out about their family ties. Well, Aunt Judith told Big Jim and Shirley Holmes and Dubs and Evelyn Ollinger they was as much family as her own and don't be strangers. They told her they ain't never seen so much excitement in their lives till all these here boys got hooked up. Said they was like their own too, and the boys was more like brothers. Also said they was proud to meet her and she ought to visit them back home when she could. In the weeks and years to follow, Old McBrayer whiskey come to be the finest whiskey known to be made, and it was in such huge demand the distillery couldn't keep up. Orders was took first come, first served, but Jesse and Buster and Elizabeth Jane agreed not to expand, leastways not yet. They wanted to keep it small and a quality bourbon to be envied. Them 72 barrels soon had twins to 'em on the other side of the limestone cave for only the family. One day when the aging was complete, a good tasting to compare the two would be made in a little ceremony honoring the tradition of the McBrayers. This sure enough was going to be done before she kicked the bucket, said Aunt Judith. All the boys in the family said they'd be right there whenever she made the call. At Christmas time, Elizabeth Jane wrote and said she sure enough was in love, and her beau asked her to marry him. The wedding was to be at McBrayer Springs next June. She said his name was Collins Amschel Freeman. Y'all have a blessed day. The rest is a-coming. Goodbye.